Good evening, here in House Edith Maryon, Jede Goethe Annum, and hopefully internationally today we will commemorate in a way the 50th anniversary of her death, of Hannah Arendt, who died, most of you know, 4th of December 1975 in New York. 4 days after she died, in a memorial speech, Hans Jonas, her friend and philosopher as well, said things look different after she had looked at them. Today we will look from the perspective of Hannah Arendt and later on also from the perspective of Rudolf Steiner in his 100th death year to very actual contemporary issues and questions. This is the challenge of evil and the challenge of the human will capacity. I will first make a little sketch of the life and work biography of Hannah Arendt, only some minutes hopefully, and then I will give the place to Constanza Kalix, and her presentation is the topic of evil and the human will capacity in the work of Hannah Arendt. Then we will have a short break, 10 minutes, and then the second contribution will be mine about the same issues in the life work of Rudolf Steiner, evil and the human will. So, just a short, I would say, a memorial sketch. I said Hannah Arendt died in 1975 in New York City on this 4th of December, aged 69. That means she was born in October 96 in the German city Hanover. And most of you will know she didn't stay there for a long time. The family moved to Königsberg, and later on she escaped at the beginning of First World War with her mother because father already died, to Berlin for a short time. They returned again to Königsberg, and having finished the school she went to different universities, the same Berlin, but also then Marburg, where she met Martin Heidegger, the philosopher, and others, and then Freiburg, and then finally, and this was also the place for her PhD, Heidelberg. And then together with her first husband, or with her husband, to Berlin. They lived together in Berlin till the time came when the Nazi party overtook the government. That means her husband, he's very famous in Germany under the name Anders, Günther Anders. At this time he was called Günther Stern, escaped directly to Paris, to France. She stayed in Berlin mainly to support refugees, to support other Jewish people, but finally was imprisoned. And then, by chance, she also escaped to Paris. From then on, for about 7 years or a little bit more, she lived in Paris, supported mainly Zionist organizations. She has never been a Zionist in the sense of a political Zionism, but she saw the absolute need for preparing an escape country, and so forth. She helped a lot of people, young people especially, to come to Palestine, and she was close also to Martin Buber. So I would say a cultural Zionism was, yes, in her vision, but she had different ideas, different from later Ben Gurion and other politicians, how to prepare such a new country. But this is well known. Over 7 years she worked for the Zionist organization, but then was imprisoned when the German army came to France, but she was not imprisoned by the Germans first, but by the French government, because she was German, Jewish and German, and came to a concentration camp, but only for 6 weeks, and could escape. From that time on, she said later, she closely followed the path of those people who were deported and brought to the concentration camps. She could escape, as I mentioned, and she could finally escape to the United States of America. And this happened in May 1941 when she was 35 years of age. The ship to New York, and in fact New York was from now on, apart from different journeys, her place where she died, as I mentioned. In 1942, 1943, maybe an anthroposophical point of view, it's the second moon note for her. She acquired detailed knowledge about what was going on in the concentration camps, especially the Germans erected in Poland. That means Auschwitz-Birkenau, this kind of systematic or even machine or even fabric killing. And she said this was the shock. So for her, the ending of the old history was not 1933, but 1943, when these huge gas chambers came into function. At this time, she worked as an essay writer, more or less, for Jewish magazines from New York on, and her special theme was the destiny and the need and the horrible situation of the Jews, but also Jewish resistance and hopefully other forms of resistance. And already in these times of war, she made deep reflections about the whole question and challenge of refugees. She said the refugees, the stateless people, this is a new phenomenon in history, and this is the avant-garde of peoples. She also had the idea that the national states will come to an end, and these stateless people are not only the people in need of support, but also maybe the pioneers for a new situation of an organized society without national states. The war was over, I make it very short, and she went on with her studies, which are closely related to our theme today, these centers of evil, which we call the German concentration camp system. And for her, I summarize it, for her this was not only a horrible new type of prison, as history had many types of prison, but for her it was an experimental, a laboratorium place for the total domination of what we call a human being. So she said the Hitler regime not only wanted to have a world domination, but mainly a transformation and domination of human beings. Transformation in the sense of eliminating any freedom, eliminating any spontaneity, to create or to transform human beings in dead things, even if they are still alive. So this kind of transformation of human beings as human beings was, in her perspective, the central core. So a path which will finally lead to a destruction of the human individuality and creating another world she saw coming. So, and this was published in a journal called Jewish Social Studies in 1950. I think it was the first remarkable reflective text about the system of the concentration camps, not by a survivor of the camps, but by a philosopher, an existential philosopher. And a year after, 1951, we know very well, it was the famous year when she published the origins of totalitarianism, So maybe her major work about this new form of government, she said, this is not only dictatorship in the 20th century, this is a new type of government in the direction of a systematic elimination of humanity. And she said also this kind of evil, this kind of radical evil cannot be grasped by previous moral teachings, or speaking of sins and speaking of moral aberrations. She said this is something new, what we have to consider. Later came the book about human condition, but also condition in the sense of the human will. Vita Activa is the German title, and maybe you know that she published these books in German, in English, and she wrote these books. Also the book about the totalitarian system, she wrote them twice, in English first, in German second. So it's not a translation only, it's a second German version. In 1933 she became, in an unwilled way, prominent as a person, a philosopher who reflected the Eichmann trial. So one of these main figures of the SS system, the man who protocoled the Wannsee Conference, the man who organized the deportations to the concentration camps, was, as you all know, in Jerusalem on trial. And she published a report. She saw a quarter of all the interrogations of the process against Eichmann. And she published this report, this Eichmann report, but the subtitle is indicating in a certain way, which was not only discussed but also became a center of a fight, because the subtitle is On the Banality of Evil. And she said more or less that from her observation, and against her own expectations, Eichmann was not obsessed by ideology. There was no demonism. He was functioning as a functioneer. She said it was we can say the perversion of action. It was an inability to think, a loss of reality of the reality of the other ones, but only in a certain sense a functionaire in a functioning system. And this, apart from other remarks, it's her second moon note, by the way, brought her in the center of a heavy and very aggressive public discussion about her views on Eichmann against demonism. She never denied there is a level of evil which maybe can also be called demonic, but she said even if the public media wanted to present a monster, Eichmann is not that monster. He's incredibly primitive, he's incredibly boring, he's a German functionary, but you can't make a personification of evil in exactly that man, because this was also a certain tendency. So we have 5 people or 10 people and they are the demons and the rest of the society is more or less innocent, which wasn't the case. I make it very simple. I only say it's part of her life struggle, her biography, and also her writing on evil. I just want to come to an end to mention her important speech a year later, held in many radio broadcasts in the United States, Personal Responsibility Under Dictatorship. Because this was for her one of the key elements for the past and the future. Yes, dictatorship or even totalitarian systems, but there is still personal responsibility. And the question of personal responsibility means that we have to learn to live with ourselves. That means, she also said, a kind of a silent dialogue, a silent conversation between our I consciousness and our higher self. So, and we call this dialogue, since, she said, since Socrates and Plato, we call it thinking. So the thinking capacity of or we can also the thinking need of a human being is this dialogue with oneself. And the moral responsibility can only be the result of this dialogue. When she published this wonderful interview abroad, she was working as a professor, mainly in Chicago, and then 3 years later, from 1967 on, in the New School for Social Research as her new husband, Heinrich Blücher. I will end with mentioning that, and coming to our time partly also, that half a year before she died in Boston, in the Ford Hall Forum, she gave a long lecture. It was the commemoration of 200 years of the US Revolution. And she made a very, very critical speech, because she was originally a fan, I can't say, but she was always promoting the United States of America, because she said this is not a national society. This is a coming together historically from different societies, ethnics, and so on. And she found that the US American Constitution is something, not an archetype for others, but something belonging to the future. But she saw, and she saw it quite earlier than Nixon, but then also Nixon and the other ones, an enormous decline of the US society. And she spoke in this last long public lecture, but also some years before in her essay about lyings and politics, reflections on the Pentagon Papers, about a certain tendency, but not only in the United States of America, but it was detected in the United States of America, because the so-called Pentagon Papers were hidden papers about the background of the war in Vietnam and the intended deception of the public, or better to say, the intended creating of a public opinion. How to create a public opinion, and she researched and also published that there were a lot of new people involved, and there were mainly professionals of advertising. There were theorists of digital games. There were system theorists. How to create a public opinion, how to manipulate public opinion. And for her, this was one of the main challenges of the future. She was always promoting the public. And insofar also she was a passionate articles reader, journals reader. But then she saw in her last years, or even in some decades, there was a transformation, a manipulation of the public opinion and a kind of fabrication of images, which was the terminus she used in the Boston or in the Ford Hall Forum speech in May 1975. And she ended, but Constanza will talk about this, with her last book, The Life of the Mind. The Life of the Mind, and she didn't complete this big book, but Constanza will present. So the end of her biography was not the end of the work, maybe, but hopefully this little sketch about a Jewish refugee from Germany to the United States, witnessing her time, witnessing the decline of society, but also, I think, showing where there is a path to the future. So we don't create a seminar only about evil. This wouldn't be in the sense of Hannah Arendt and Steiner, but a little seminar about evil and the human will capacity. So I hand it over to Constanza to go on. Thank you.
Good afternoon here in House Maryon, and hello for those who are hearing from other places. Thank you very much for joining this little commemoration for this special date in Hannah Arendt's work and life, 50 years after her death. And I will try now to describe a little bit some of the many approaches she developed on both topics, the topic of the will and the topic of evil. And I will start with the topic of the will, and then I will go to the topic of evil. But we need to know that in a certain sense, both have been very integrated during all her life, and both also are from the very beginning in her consciousness, even though when she starts to write in her doctoral thesis, she was only 22 at that point. She wrote her doctoral thesis with Jaspers, Karl Jaspers, who became then, who was for her a very important person until the end of his life and the end of her life also. From the very beginning on, we can say, in these first writings, we can already see that the questions about the will and the questions about the evil, or let's say the dangers in the will, as also the possibilities of a free will, are present there with this very young student, scholar and wise person, Hannah Arendt, even when she was 22. So she doctorated about the topic of the concept of love in Augustine. And this is remarkable. A Jewish young person is choosing this, the concept of love, in one of the first, or we can say one of the first big remarkable philosopher of Christianity, Augustine. And we can see that there, when she starts, and I will go back to that point many times today, she already speaks about this love in relation to the will, and the will in relation to freedom and in relation to danger. Yeah, we already heard, Peter Selk told us a little bit about her very last book, The Life of Mind. And it's very interesting that in this, her last writings, so she died on a Thursday, and until Saturday before, so 5 days before her death, she finished the chapter about the will. And it was for her very challenging to write about the will, because the will, in a certain sense, was unknown, and we will hear her quotes about that, was very unknown for philosophers for hundreds of years, and she will also say why. And at the same time, she says, without the will, we also would be not able to think and to do anything. So we need to, in a certain sense, to put light into a sphere that escapes first to this enlightenment. This last chapter, or this last book, The Life of Mind, was relying on lectures she gave in 1973, the so-called Gifford lectures. And in these first lectures, she spoke about thinking. This is the first part of the book. Then in 1974, in continuation on these Gifford lectures, the second series of lectures were about the will. And the last part of this book would be about judging. I will come back to that in the very end. And this was not completed in her lifetime. It's very beautiful also to hear the editor of this last book, this posthum published book, This work was done by Mary McCarthy, a very, very close friend to her. And in a farewell to Hannah, in her farewell to Hannah, she writes the following, Mary McCarthy. Her last book was to be called The Life of Mind, and was intended as a counterpart of her work, The Human Condition, which was first called Vita Activa. In this book, she had considered the triad of labor, production, and action, the human being as anima laborans, also as homo faber, and then as a public person. She also saw the life of the mind, the so-called vita contemplativa, as divided into three parts: thinking, willing, and judging. The first section on thinking had been completed some time ago, and she finished the second section on the will shortly before her death. It must have been a relief for her, as she had found that of the three faculties, the will was the most difficult. She had already drafted the third part on judgment in her mind and had already dealt with it in part of lectures. Yeah, so just for us to hear, writing about the will was a goal for her and not an easy one. So coming back to the very beginning of her writings on her doctoral thesis with Karl Jaspers on the subject of the concept of love with Augustine, there she writes that for Augustine, the question of love is also a question in which extent we can say that love reveals a capacity for the community life, because that love is a capacity for the personal life that we know, but in which extent love is a main ground for the common life in community. And in the beginning of the text, also referring to Augustine, she says that love is connected to desire. In Latin, amor qua appetitus. Love as a desire, as an appetite. Because the human beings are not self-sufficient, but they are always related to something else, to something. And this structure of striving, of orienting oneself towards something that transcends oneself, of relating to something that one is not oneself, is also a reflexive capacity. That means that the one who strives is also conscious of himself and of its striving. And so she will say that love, as this striving, as this appetitus, as this directive desire, that love is both self-constituting, self-forming, and also a relational event, and that means that love means something not only for the lover himself, but love also shapes society. And she will say, she will write that love, the love to the world establishes the world for myself. The love to the world, the love for the world is that what establishes the world for myself. And she also sees that there is an ambivalence of love, because on one hand, love can be, in a certain sense, when it exists in between two persons, put all apart, and the whole world vanishes in this essential love. Or, and this is the ambivalence of love, love can constitute the reality of the world as a connection to the otherness of myself, for myself. And this idea, love as a foundation of the world, is a topic that Hannah Arendt will return to again and again. Yeah, and she will also refer to this topic of love in connection to the world and in connection to the questions on being part of this active shaping society. She will come back to that many, many times. And as an example, I will quote her in a lecture she gave 1966 in Chicago about basic moral propositions, and she says there, according to Augustine, amo, volo ut sis. I love, that means I want you to be. Amo, volo ut sis. I love, that means I want you to be. My affirmation of what is or who is brings me into relation with what is anyway, just as my negation alienates me from it. In this sense, the world is dilectoris mundi, and the lovers of the world are the world, or love for the world establishes the world for me. The love for the world establishes the world for me. Yeah, she will bring that many, many times also in her diaries, which she began to write in 1950. And now I will go a step further and I will go into this topic of the difficulty to speak about the will. And she will write in The Life of Mind, the greatest difficulty in any treatment of the will is the simple fact that no other faculty of the mind has had its existence so emphatically doubted and refuted by so many eminent philosophers. So the will was not only not a topic for philosophers for decades, for hundreds of years, but she says many of them denied the existence of the will. And then she writes, any critical examination of the capacity of the will is, by its very nature, conducted by professional thinkers, and this arouses the suspicion that the dismissal of the will as mere deception of consciousness and the denial of its existence altogether, as it occurs with almost identical arguments among philosophers of various schools, could be based on a fundamental conflict between the experiences of the thinking and the willing ego. Although it is always the same mind that thinks and wills, just as it is the same self that unites the body, the soul, and the spirit. And immediately she will speak about the connection of the will to the free will. I quote her again, the criterion for a free action is always the awareness that one could also have refrained from it, which by no means applies to mere desire or craving, where physical needs, the necessities of life processes, or the mere power of wanting to have something at hand can overturn all considerations of will or reason. Willing seems to possess infinitely more freedom than thinking, which even in its freest, most speculative form cannot escape the law of consistency. This undeniable fact has never been perceived by thinking people as a pure advantage of will, but rather as a challenge. So she says, real freedom could be something that relies in will, but not totally in thinking. Because even if I think in a very free way, in a very speculative way, I will never escape in thinking to the law of consistency. Yeah, and she says that as a scholar in philosophy. Yeah, so one of her very important works, and already we heard about it, was based on lectures he gave in the University of Chicago in 1956, and it was entitled, the series of lectures, The Labor of Man's Body and the Work of His Hands. And it's from then on that she will develop the idea of writing about the human activities. And first she thought on writing about that, and the name of the book would be Amor Mundi, The Love to the World. But then she changed, and the book, when it was finally written, first in English 1958 and then in German 1960, as we already heard, was called The Human Condition, and in German Vita Activa. And in this book she will examine the different layers of the human activity. And she will say that a first layer is the layer of labor. And she calls this layer labor, meaning these actions that we take just to enable life to go on. All the things we do on daily basis, or people do on daily basis for others, to enable life to still exist. This is what she will then call labor. And another realm of the human action is the realm in which the human being develops that what will appear. And this is what she calls the fabric, or the productivity, the production, that what the human being is able to fulfill as Homo faber. And she embraces all what remains in the world with this concept, all what we construct, all what we build, all that what is also deeply connected to creativity and to the power of forming something, all related to technology, we could say, also all what is related to art. All that is part of this realm of producing, of establishing a new world in the already existing world, the world of the things, the world of the creation, the human being as Homo faber, the human being as creator. And finally she says, the human being has the realm of action. And this is the realm in which the human being connects to the world that is a common world, connects to all what is societal. And this is for her the realm in which we really are active, and the realm in which we speak. Speaking, thinking and acting are for Hannah Arendt the ground for the common world, for the societal realm, and this is where the human being lives when he is paris inter pares, together with the others who are also there. And for her, this speaking and this action in that sense is the source for always new beginnings. And she says that the world is renewed by the birth of every individual, because something new is coming into the world, never seen before. And with this new presence in the world, new words, new actions will potentially start. So she writes, I'll quote a little bit of her, of Vita Activa. Through speech and action, we enter the world of human beings that existed before we were born. And this entry is like a second birth, in which we acknowledge the bare fact of being born and, as it were, we take responsibility for it. In this most original and general sense, acting, and starting something new are one and the same. Every action initially sets something in motion. Because every human being, by virtue of being born, is an initium, a beginning and a newcomer to the world, humans can take initiative, become beginners, and set new things in motion. Man was created, before whom there was no one else, in the words of Augustine. Yeah, and then in Vita Activa, she already asks a question that will come back when we enter the realm of the evil, and this is, how can the human being really act in knowing that whatever we do, it will enter the fabric of the world events, of the world becomings, and we can never stop them or bring it back. So whatever we do has a characteristic of being irrevocable and at the same time unpredictable. It's irrevocable, I can't bring it back. It's unpredictable, I don't know what will come from that. And she asks herself, how can we even start acting? This most human capacity, transformative capacity, life-enabling capacity, creative capacity, if things that we do are irrevocable and unpredictable. And then she writes something that stays remarkable until the end of her work, and she will say, these two characteristics of whatever we do, they have and they need a remedy. She says a remedy. And she says the remedy for the fact that what has been done cannot be undone is the capacity we have to forgive. The remedy to the irrevocable characteristic of what we do is our capacity to forgive. And the remedy for the unpredictability, that means for the chaotic uncertainty of the future, lies in the ability to make and to keep promises. So both remedies, the capacity to forgive and the strength of keeping and making promises. These are the two remedies that enables us to act facing the reality of the irrevocable and the unpredictable characteristic of whatever we do. Yeah. In the Life of Mind, in the already mentioned chapter about the will, she will refer again to Augustinus, and she makes again clear there that for Augustinus, love is the intensification of will. And in the same sense, Scotus, Duns Scotus, from the 13th century, this Franciscan monk and philosopher, he also will say that the intensification of will is that what we call love. And she writes in a wonderful, wonderful way about Scotus. And I would like to quote, after the transformation of the will into love, the human spirit is restlessness, but not extinguished. The constancy of love is not noticeable as a standstill of movement, but as the serenity of a movement that is at rest within itself, self-fulfilling, but never-ending. This is not the calm and bliss that follows a perfectly successful action, but the stillness of an act that rests in its goal. In this life, we know such acts from our inner experience and according to Scotus, we should be able to understand them as premonitions of an uncertain future in which they would never cease. Then, the capacity for action will find its rest in its object through the perfect act, through love, by which it attains it. The idea that there could be an activity that finds its goal in itself is just as surprisingly original, without precedent or successor in Western intellectual history, as Scotus' ontological preference for the contingent over the necessary and for the existing particular over the general. I have tried to show, and this now is, I think, is remarkable also in relation on what we will hear about Steiner later. Again, I'm quoting Hannah Arendt. I have tried to show that in Scotus we are not dealing with the mere conceptual reversals, but with genuinely new insights, all of which can be understood as the speculative condition for a philosophy of freedom. So, what Scotus is doing, speaking about this intensification of the will as love, and love for action as not something that needs a goal, but that then can realize in itself, but continuing in movement, Hannah Arendt says this could be or could be understood as a condition for a philosophy of freedom. Yeah, so maybe so far, and now I would go to the transition to the theme, to the topic of evil. And in this transition, I would like to quote her from this lecture she gave 1965 about the evil. The name of the lectures in publication were On Evil, Lectures on Questions of Ethic. And it's very interesting that she gave these lectures, and then later on she took what she had typed, because it's typographed. She prepared everything, or all her lectures, typographing them. And then I will read both versions of the same for this transition from the will to the questions of evil. The will is the arbiter between reason and desire, and as such, it alone is free. Moreover, while reason reveals what is common to all human beings, and desire what is common to all living organisms, only the will is entirely my own. So she says, reason is what all human beings have in common, and desire all living organisms has in common, but only the will is entirely my own. And now the variation in the way she prepared. At this point, it becomes clear that, strictly speaking, neither reason nor desire are free, but the will is free, as the capacity to choose. Moreover, reason reveals what all human beings have in common because of their humanity. Desire is common to all living organisms. Only the will is entirely my own. By willing, I decide. And that is the capacity for freedom. Yeah. This big theme of evil started to be present in her life, also in her biography, very, very early. But then, with the whole trial, and accompanying the trial of Eichmann in Jerusalem, she describes in which extension also what she witnesses there ask her again to come back to the questions of examining thinking. And she writes the following: is the problem of good and evil our ability to distinguish between right and wrong, perhaps related to our capacity for thought? The following question arose: could thinking as such, the habit of examining everything that happens or attracts attention regardless of the results and specific content, be one of the conditions that prevent people from doing evil or even predispose them against it? And if it's the case that thinking is connected to this, to evil, then thinking must be examined. And this is what she will do again and again and again, examining thinking. And she will speak and write in very different ways about evil. And I would like to bring some of them. Many of them were very controversial, as we already heard. Peter Zelk spoke about that, the radicality and the banality connected to evil was something that was very controversial at her time and later also. But she is trying to describe something that is on one hand something that she experienced, something that she see and perceive, and at the same time she wants to understand it. So it's always both trying to conceptualize, that means to understand, to bring it in words, something that finally, as she also will say, is beyond words. So she writes in her diary, as I already said, which she started to write 1950, she writes in June of 1950 the following: radical evil is that which should not have happened, that with which one cannot come to terms, that which one cannot accept as fate under any circumstances, and what which one cannot pass over in silence. It is that for which one cannot take responsibility, because its consequences are unforeseeable, and because among these consequences there is no punishment that would be adequate. This does not mean that every evil must be punished, but it must be punishable if one is to be able to reconcile oneself with it or turn away from it. And a little bit later she writes, radical evil, where does it come from? Where is its origin? What is its foundation? Yeah. When she wrote then her book published in 1951, The Origins of Totalitarianism, that appears 1955 in German under the title Elemente und Ursprünge totaler Herrschaft, Elements and Origins of Totalitarian Rule, she sends the book to her teacher Karl Jaspers in Basel. And he reads it, and he is, impressed, very impressed, but also shocked. And she writes a letter to her, and she writes, has Yahweh not disappeared too much? Yeah, it's a very beautiful question for her teacher in philosophy to ask her, has Yahweh not disappeared too much? And then she writes back to him, for weeks now your question, has Yahweh not disappeared too much, has been on my mind without me knowing the answer. And then she continues, evil has proven to be more radical than anticipated. Externally speaking, modern crimes are not covered by the 10 Commandments, or Western tradition suffers from the prejudice that the worst things human can do stems from devices or selfishness, whereas we know that the worst of radical evil has nothing to do with such human comprehensible things and sinful motives. I do not know what radical evil really is, but it seems to me that it has something to do with the following phenomena: the superfluousness of human beings as human beings, not using them as a means to an end which leaves their humanity untouched and only violates their human dignity, but making them superfluous as human beings. So that this could be something that has to do with the phenomena of radical evil, this making human beings as human beings superfluous. Yeah. And in the first edition of The Origins of Totalitarianism, she wrote concluding remarks. And these concluding remarks in the first edition, that means in the English one, are the following. For those who have been excluded from humanity and human history and deprived of the basic conditions of human existence, need the solidarity of all people to secure their rightful place in the continuing human chronicle. At the very least, we can call out to each of them who is rightly desperate, saying, "Do not harm to yourself, for we are all here." This was how she finished first. But then in subsequent editions, also including the German one, she will end the book thinking on abandonment and loneliness. And she says, the destruction of plurality is that what finally leads to this evil. And she writes about abandonment and loneliness. She says loneliness is something human. I need to be with myself as with another, lonely, speaking, pondering, remembering, deepening what happened, and in a certain sense, pondering for myself. Can I live with the consequences of these deeds? This is loneliness, a very important moment of our human existence. But when we are in loneliness, we are always in the danger of transforming this loneliness in abandonment. And abandonment is when I stop pondering, when I stop talking with myself, when I am really only abandoned. And she says, I quote her, "In abandonment, people are truly alone, abandoned not only by other people and the world, but also by the self, which can be everyone in solitude. Thus, they are unable to realize the conflict of solitude and unable to maintain their own identity with themselves, which is no longer confirmed by others. In this abandonment, the self and the world, and with them the genuine capacity for thought and for experience, perish at the same time. The abandoned person rightly begins to doubt a reality that no one can reliably confirm, for this world offers security only insofar as it is guaranteed to us by the others." And that, she says, can lead to this, that from then on, the only thing that is reliable is the strict logic. In the situation of abandonment, strict, compelling logic seems to be the only remaining factor to be considered. And then the human being loses totally the relation to reality, just following a strict logic that has no connection anymore to that what are the human needs, to that what are the human needs, to that what are the capacity to respond to them. Yeah. And so we can say that the will, that the capacity of action and the evil are in a certain sense always deeply, deeply connected. And now I would like, in the last part of this short presentation, go back to these lectures on evil, lectures on questions of ethics. And these lectures were given, as I already said, in 1965, entitled at that point as Some Questions on Moral Philosophy. And she gave these lectures in the New School for Social Research, already mentioned here today, in New York. And she brings there, in a certain sense, together many of these thoughts that she developed before, also in her writings. And she ponders also a little bit, and she will say that the freedom in the will is not connected to things that are coercive, in the sense that I would say I cannot do that, but they are connected to something deeper in our own being, so that the things are not things that I cannot do, but things for those I will say I must not do that. And she brings that in relation to those, she says, in Germany, in Nazi Germany, who really had nothing to do, she says, that for those who were blameless in the moral collapse of Nazi Germany. And she says, if you look to them, and she says there are few, the very few who remained completely blameless in the moral collapse of Nazi Germany, you will discover that they never went through anything like a great moral conflict or a crisis of conscience. They did not give much thought to the various issues, the lesser evil, loyalty to their country or their oath, or whatever else may have been at stake. Nothing of the sort. They may have discussed the pros and cons or the actions, and there were always many reasons to believe that there was a little chance of success. They may also have been afraid, and there was indeed much to fear. But they never doubted that crimes, even if legalized by the government, remained crimes, and that it was better not to participate in these crimes under any circumstances. In other words, they felt no obligation, but acted in accordance with something that was self-evident to them, even if it was no longer self-evident to those around them. Their conscience, if that is what it was not coercive in nature. It said, I cannot do that. Instead, I must not do that. Yeah, and then she says that memory is something absolutely necessary for these questions of the nature of evil. And she says that having the capacity of memory, of memorizing, of thinking afterwards on what happened, this is where we have the possibility to bring into balance for ourselves that what exists in the world. And I quote her again. This question of memory brings us at least a small step closer to the agonizing question of the nature of evil. Philosophy knows the villain only as someone who is desperate and who despair surrounds him with a certain nobility. I do not deny that this type of evildoers exist, but I am certain that the greatest evils we know cannot be attributed to him, who must look himself in the eye again, and whose curse is that he cannot forget. The greatest evildoers are those who do not remember, because they have never given any thought to what they have done, and without memory, nothing can hold them back. For human beings, thinking about past events means entering the dimension of debt, putting down roots, and thus stabilizing oneself so that one is not swept away by all kinds of things, the spirit of the times, history, or simply temptation. So, the greatest evil is not radical, it has no roots. And because it has no roots, it has no limits. It can develop into unimaginable extremes and spread throughout the world. So the greatest evil has no roots, and because it has no roots in the human being, it can develop into extremes and spread out all around. And then she also says and writes later, when forgiveness is granted, it is not the crime that is forgiven, but the person. With rootless evil, there is no longer a person to whom the human being could ever forgive. So, and here we see the question when evil starts to live into a system. There is no one to be blamed, or 5 or 10, but it has, in a certain sense, no roots anymore in a human person. Yeah. And she writes about that. Boundless, extreme evil is only possible where the self-imposed and grown roots, which automatically limits possibilities, are completely absent. They are absent where people glide over the surface of events, where they allow themselves to be carried away without ever penetrating any depth of which they may be capable. So we see for her this extreme evil is not possible, will not happen if we have these deep, deep roots, self-imposed and grown roots. These grown roots would automatically limit the possibilities for evil. But this extreme evil is there when there is an absence of these roots, where people glide over the surface of events, where they allow themselves to be carried away without ever penetrating any depth of which they may be capable. Yeah, so then she goes on and she will say that the most important question we should ask ourselves is with whom we want to stay close. Because we need the others in the ponderation, we need the others to deepen our own roots in ourselves, facing the reality of the other. And so those who are around us, they are essential. Again, I quote, "To put it in another way, the greatest evil committed is the evil that was done by no one, that is, by human beings who refuse to be persons. Within the conceptual framework of these considerations, we could conclude that perpetrators who refuse to think about what they are doing and also who also resist thinking about it afterwards have actually failed to constitute themselves as someone. By stubbornly remaining a nobody, they prove themselves incapable of communication with others who, whether good, evil, or indeterminable in this respect, are at least persons. And in the very end of these 4 lectures, she says, I try to show that our decisions about right and wrong will depend on the choice of our society and on the choice of those with whom we wish to spend our lives. Indifference, morally and politically speaking, possess the greatest danger, even if it is widespread. Indifference, morally and politically speaking, possess the greatest danger, even if it's widespread. And associate with this, and only slightly less dangerous, is another common modern phenomenon, the frequently encountered tendency to refuse to judge at all. The unwillingness or inability to choose one's examples and one's associates, and the unwillingness or inability to relate to others through judgment, give rise to the real scandala, the real stumbling blocks that human power cannot remove because they were not caused by human or humanly understandable motives. Therein lies the horror of evil and at the same time its banality. Yeah, so the indifference and the refuse and the unwillingness to think and to judge, these for her, in these lectures clearly expressed, are the dangers for this not understandable evil. And now, to close, I would like, because it's kind of maybe also a bridge to Rudolf Steiner at that point in a certain sense, I want to, also thinking on his 100 years of death this year, to just say some words about the very, very last lecture he gave to teachers. And in this very last lecture he gave, it was on the 30th of August 1924 in London, he speaks about the necessity of education, and he calls the needs in the different phases of the growing of the child, he calls it with different names, or he describes the need for education in these different phases in a total new way, in a way he never did before in his hundreds of lectures he gave to teachers and for education. And he will say that in the first years, the children would need an education that gives form, I will not go deeper on that at that point. You will immediately understand why I bring that now. Between the first moment of completion of the physical body, that means when the needs change, and the sexual maturity for this period in school, we need to enable an educational surrounding that is enlivening, full of life and enlivening. And then, from the moment of sexual maturity on, we need to promote an education that is awakening. And he says awakening for the possibility to the free judgment, to the autonomous free judgment. And I think that here Steiner, in a certain sense, is in conversation with Hannah Arendt. We will hear more about that later. But in a conversation exactly about that, if we want to promote an education that goes against indifference, morally and politically, as she says, an education that gives a ground for a participative transformation in society together and with the others, then the ground for that will be given by the capacity of judging, of an autonomous and free judgment. And it's unbelievable, I think, that this is what Steiner points out in his very last lecture on education. What we need to offer is an education that enables a capacity of judgment, and he calls that an awakening education. Awakening against, I would say, indifference, awakening against this abandonment. And now I would like to close with some words from Hannah Arendt, from her speech, already also mentioned here, the speech he gives when she received, 1959, the Lessing Prize. And she speaks about things that resounds, I would say, even today, very, very strongly in our different realms of societal reality. The world lies between people, and this in between, much more than, as is often thought, people or even human beings, is today the subject of the greatest concern and the most obvious upheaval in almost all countries of the world. Even where the world is still reasonably in order or is being kept reasonably in order, the public sphere has lost the luminosity that was originally part of its very essence. More and more people in the countries of the Western world, which since the decline of antiquity has understood freedom from politics as one of its fundamental freedoms, are making use of this freedom and have withdrawn from the world and the obligations it entails. This withdrawal from the world need not harm people. It can even enhance great talents to the point of genius and thus indirectly benefit the world again. However, with each such withdrawal comes an almost demonstrable loss of the world. What is lost is the specific and usually irreplaceable space that would have formed between this person and their fellow human beings. Yeah, maybe so far about these very big questions on the will and the evil and the human reality. And now we would have maybe 7 minutes until past here in Europe, 3 until past wherever you are, the 7 next minutes. And then we would go with Peter Zell to the topic of the evil and the will in Rudolf Steiner. Thank you very much for your attention.
So, welcome again to the second part of this very serious topic and seminar about evil and the dimension of the human will, the humanistic will. And as you know, Dr. Steiner, in his biography, he only faced, we could say, the First World War and not the Holocaust, not the concentration camps, but he also faced these years after the First World War with the political radicalization, the racial radicalization, and many of the abysses of the future. And especially I would like to say he faced this problem from the beginning. When he grew up in the latest part of the 19th century, he said the materialism will come to its consequences in the future. So this image of man as a machine, this will be the ground for the destruction in the coming century. So I don't think that Rudolf Steiner would have been shocked or would have been surprised of all the events starting in the 1930s, culminating first of all in the Second World War and the Shoah. But as you all know, it was not the end of the radical evil. And when Steiner, shortly before he opened the School for Spiritual Science, said in a public lecture in the Swiss city of Bern, Western culture and the development of humanity will come to a premature end if people do not decide to save them. He clearly saw that there can be an end of human culture on earth soon as maybe the 20th century is coming to an end. And then he added at a certain point of the same public lecture, only what people do to save the declining civilization from within themselves counts. So there will be no spiritual hierarchies, there will be no God who will save mankind on earth, only what people do to save the declining civilization from within themselves counts. And I want to underline this in the sense of a school for spiritual science, which was never meant to be an additional wonderful place to experience esotericism or only peace or other achievements of human soul development. It was meant to be as a side of receiving or developing forces to resist, to go forward in the 20th century and beyond, in this time of radical evil, a needed place for a schooling path to resist and to overcome the abyss for the future. So we heard about Hannah Arendt's estimation of maybe what Kant called the absolute value of a human being. And he said this absolute value of a human being is strongly related to the autonomy of the will. Kant, he said, this is the point, the autonomy of the will and the absolute value of the human being, because this is the only being on earth who has the ability to develop this, what Kant called free will. Or Hegel said at a certain point, the human ego or the self is at home in the world once it has understood it, this world, but then has the possibility to imprint the traits of the spiritual, of its own spirituality in the world that is no longer a strange world. So first we have to understand the world, to become at home here, and then we have to imprint our own spirituality. And I think this is very concrete. I mean, in education, in medicine, the new imprint which is needed, a spiritual imprint, but it's coming out of the will, of a spiritual understanding of the will, which is closely related, as Dr. Steiner said, to the whole question of our self. The self-dimension of the will was a topic quite often underlined by Steiner. The self is actually entirely of a volitional nature. So the will dimension of the self, or to bring it in the form of Schiller, he once said that there is no other power in man than his will. No other power. There are many other forces, but a kind of a power. All other things must. Man is the being that wills, Schiller stated. So we come closer or make a next step of this understanding, this anthropological basis of what is the human will and why Hannah Arendt or Steiner called this will dimension an organ of freedom and the future, fundamentally indeterminated. Out of our will dimension, also this will dimension of a school for spiritual science can bring something anew in the world. A thing which is really unpredictable in the sense of Hannah Arendt and completely anew. Not just going on with the past. Of course, this kind of future is always uncertain. Hegel said the quality of the past is the calmness, the calm of the past and the restlessness of the future. But the restlessness is in a way immanent in the mind. And in so far reaching out into the future. These acts of will they have the potential to create something anew and have the potential, as we heard, to transcend ourselves. And this is one of the most basic phenomena of our will action, that if we really act in the sense of Hannah Arendt, we transcend our organism. We relate to the environment. We are immanent in the environment. And Steiner said also in a very simple way, because if we really act, we have to know about the world, we have to use the laws, not the laws in the sense of the state, but the physical laws. If somebody wants to do something, he must know about these kind of laws, these kind of structures immanent in the world, and to have to imprint in themselves. So in a way, as we heard, our will actions, they are connected with our individuality, and also they awaken us for our individuality. We become aware of ourselves in doing, at least if we reflect about our deeds, and we can in a way recognize ourselves by our deeds or recognize the other ones by their deeds. So a self-awareness, but also an awareness or a relation to our environment, to the world is needed. And for Steiner, this is one of the basic elements of earthly evolution. Willing has only been radiated since the development of the earth. That means the will capacity is insofar anew on this evolution of the planet which we now call the earth. And as you know, Steiner described other previous stages of the evolution of the earth, but the will capacity, the will dimension, the will quality is in you. So it was late discovered, as Hannah Arendt shows in the chapter about the will in the life of the mind. It was late discovered in the, how to say, in the history of human consciousness, in the history of philosophy, as an entity. She said it was ignored by a lot of philosophers, long time. Aristotle was the first one who reflected on the will to a certain little point, but later on, as we heard Augustine, Duns Scotus, they discovered this very special dimension of the human soul, which we call the will. But it's not only late in the history of human consciousness. We can also say it's late in the not too late in the history of the earth. So, in a way, philosophy, as Dr. Steiner puts it, is always reflecting a situation which is objective. Let's say the incarnation of the human soul is a process. So it makes sense that maybe that the discovery of the will is related to what happened the last 2,000 years on earth as a kind of an incarnation of the spirit. And one of the phenomena, Dr. Steiner said, of the anthropology of the will is, if we research it deep down to the human organism, that it is essential, Dr. Steiner said, that the will forces are destructive on the first stage. He said if we want to act willingly, if we research what is happening into our human body, there is destruction. There is a flame which is in a way in the metabolic link system creating a kind of a breakdown and then rebuilding. So a phenomenon in a Goetheanistic sense is that the will, Dr. Steiner says, needs a kind of a breakdown physiologically. That means in the substance, first of all in the substance of the human organism, maybe also in the environment. So if we want to build a Goetheanum, we destroy the meadows, we destroy the wonderful green surface of the hill if we want to build a house. So maybe this is only a kind of an outer example that there is a kind of a needed transformation. So we can also say a kind of a resurrection. So we have to undergo death, but in the sense of new life, in the sense of a new creation. And as Schiller puts it, a man with will capacity means being a creator and not only a creature. So it depends on himself what is coming to the future. But of course, it's also a dangerous capacity, as we see also not only in the last 2,000 years, but also in the last 200 or 100 years, because in a way, maybe a doubled danger. Ernst Bloch, another Jewish philosopher, once said there is darkness in the sense of if we really act, we are not fully conscious. Dunkel des gelebten Augenblicks, Ernst Bloch said. And Steiner quite often underlined that the will dimension is not really conscious. So people who are acting, they are not fully conscious what they are doing, if they are doing. In the process of acting, there is something at least partially unconscious. And in this kind of darkness, there is also a potential, maybe not of destruction, but of danger. And secondly, looking back to the history of the 20th century and also facing our actual reality, we have to say that there are also conscious elements of will. So people do willingly serving the destruction, but not for resurrection, just for destruction. So will can also turn to evil in itself or by itself, or so it's not just how to say an optimistic topic. It can also be create the end. And the dimension of free will, Steiner stressed it quite often, underlined it often. It is a quality which is not, how to say, immanent to human beings. They can develop the capacity of a free will, but only, he said, we can only say that we approach free will to the extent that we have succeeded in mastering the influences of what he called Lucifer and Ahriman. So there are entities, not human entities, in Dr. Steiner's interpretation or description of the world, which are not interested in a free will capacity. And he described these kind of entities from the beginning of his anthroposophical lectures, as most of you know, in early stages of the Earth development. First of all, Lucifer became influence on human beings on Earth. So and later on, Ahriman became very, very powerful. They approached humankind, and Steiner described it in detail how they did it. And also, he said, related to these more and more powerful influences was that the spiritual world for human beings became darkened. Humanity lost its state of innocence and purity, and they accompanied the evolution in the sense of the incarnating of the soul spirit into the physical world, into the sensory world. And they darkened for a long time the spiritual homeland of human beings, from which these human beings, or these souls, better to say, have descended. And they're still there, accompanying human beings on earth, and this kind of darkness. And at a certain point, Steiner even described other, even more dangerous entities, which he called the Asuras, or the Surat being. So I don't want to go into this esoteric description, but Steiner said, if they come more and more into action, human beings will believe at a certain point that they are just animals. And they will take this worldview and self-view very seriously, and they will live accordingly to it, as they were just animals. And at the end, this kind of what he called Surat is a spiritual entity, he said, a counterforce of the sun sphere, directly trying to eliminate what we call the dimension of the higher self. The higher self of the human being, he said, this is the actual cosmic opponent of the Christ being. So it's not all about human beings, or let's say this incarnation of the soul spirit of human being on earth is accompanied by spiritual entities which are not interested that it's going well in the sense of that these human beings develop a capacity of love and freedom, but simply will act here in another way. And Steiner said, if we talk about the free will, we always have to take in mind or to consider these kinds of forces which are not interested that this free will out of our own decisions, out of our own insights will be established. Arendt demands submission, duty, a kind of submission, a kind of following the rules, or also following science without the sphere of individual judgment. So it's then only the science which leads us, or the government, without individual judgment. So maybe you know the story from the Waldorf schools when they were finally closed in Germany in the Nazi time, and 2 young students, high school students from the Stuttgart school, didn't want to accept this end of their beloved school. And they went to Berlin and they wanted to talk to the responsible ministers. And they came to one of the leading figures and they had a long discussion with this Alfred Bäumler, who was a professor for education, and he was the professor for political education in Germany. And they had a long conversation about their school. And at the end, Bäumler said, I will bring now a last question. If there is coming an order from Adolf Hitler, our chancellor, and you can't see the need for this order, will you follow the order because it's coming from Adolf Hitler or not? And they both said, we won't follow without our own insight in the sense and the need of this order. And then he became very angry and said, and that is the reason why your school will be closed forever. So in a sense, an Ahrimanic challenge just to follow a demand for submission, for duty, removed from the sphere of individual knowledge. And Steiner but also said, it will not always like this. It won't be always, because in a way people just think they follow the science or they follow a logic system. As we heard it from Hannah Arendt, at the end, if you are abandoned, in a way, maybe there is only remaining a kind of a logic intellectuality. And then Steiner said, this can happen. And then the human beings, they will function as automatism in which they are just a link, no longer themselves. All their thinking becomes an experience of the head. This alone separates them from their own heart experience and their own life of will and extinguishes their own being. This is a quotation from the Leading Thoughts. And it happens in our days that people just follow what they think, what is logic, inherent in their ideological system. Anders Breivik, the man who murdered in Norway, I don't know more how many years ago, so many young students, brought at the court in the trial. He said, if you want to kill others, you just have to follow your ideology. You can't follow your heart, and your own will is not counting. So he declares in the court, it was so close to this leading thought as a spiritual automatism in which they are a link, no longer themselves. All their thinking becoming the experience of the head. This alone separates them from their own heart experience and their own life of will and extinguishes their own being. So what we see now in terrorist attacks, in many other actions of a cruelty, of a kind of a brutality which is, as we say, completely unhuman, and wonder how they could do this. Are they human beings, or are they demons, or what happened there? I don't think that this is just the solution, but I wanted to mention that Steiner clearly perceived a coming situation where these influences get very, very strong, very strong. And sometimes we ask ourselves, where they originate, these forces. And in the direction of the Ahrimanic forces, Dr. Steiner said, there is a kind of a center in the earth. So please take care what is coming in yourselves by your own limbs. In a way, don't follow your instincts just as your instincts, because in a way you can powerless follow forces which darken yourself, and they just come into your own limbs. But we also see they come into our own heads, in the sense of that our thinking capacity is more or less transformed into a kind of a dead thinking, that the power of death or the power of Ahriman subdues ourselves, and we lose ourselves and all life in our thoughts, and this darkness is really prevalent. We have many historic examples, but I think it is also part of our actual history. But because we touched National Socialism, it's maybe as an example important, and we heard from Hannah Arendt that she really witnessed. I mean, she escaped, but many of her friends could never escape the concentration camps and the gas chamber. And we can ask ourselves, is it pure Ahrimanic? I wouldn't say, because in a way, one of the temptations of the National Socialism, Steiner would have called it also Luciferic, or the delusion of selfhood. In a way, a kind of suffocated sense of self, because these organizations as the SS, the elites, it was perfectly organized, the uniforms, the marches, this kind of propaganda. It was a movement of death and destruction with a false light. In a way, it was also something seducing, because they were thinking that this is a path to the light. If the leaders would have said, we will lead you to the darkness, they wouldn't follow. But they believed in this kind of progressive element of the light. Humanity is strongly possessed by the forces of evil, by love of evil, Dr. Steiner, in a description of what is now starting. He described a situation with an enormous intensification from the 20th century onward, where this kind possession by the forces of evil, by love of evil, will be an element of our daily life, maybe not, but at least of what is happening on the social political sphere. But it's maybe important in the sense of self-knowledge that Steiner said we should not try to perceive the so-called evil forces only outside, So in the other ones, or in certain politicians, or in certain spheres of politics, we have to start with the inner drama of self-knowledge. We have to start to see where these forces are in our own thinking, feeling, and willing realms, that we all have this tendency in our will, feeling, and thinking dimension. So the inner drama of self-knowledge, insofar basic for a school for spiritual science, is our first step. And there are even exercises given by Steiner where he really said, learn to feel how it is acting in yourself, and learn to feel that there is something in you, in yourself, trying to follow the voices of Ahriman and Lucifer, and not ignoring them and saying, I'm on the Christian path or I'm on the Christ path, but also realizing, even in your own heart, these tempting impulses. Meditate on them in a balanced way, and at the end, hopefully decide for the Christ impulse, but don't think that he is from the beginning the winner. And also, anthroposophy itself is not a remedy that we are, how to say, which prevents us from getting criminal, but also it is acting in us. And Goethe once said, if he is reading a newspaper about a criminal act, he always thinks first he could have been the one doing it. So this is quite a level of self-knowledge to understand that the so-called evil is not always outside, but inside, in our own human being, not because of our moral failure, Dr. Steiner said. No, because we are human beings on earth in the 21st century. That means we are living in this sphere, and we have to understand this. And this is vital for us as individuals, but also as a co-working society, he said. The anthroposophical society or movement must have a self-awareness of these forces. They are really there. And he also said in different lectures, don't forget that Lucifer and Ahriman are not the evil, but they belong to the development of humanity on earth. And they are brought in because of the good of humanity. They can't be sent away simply. They should not be regarded as evil powers in a simple understanding, Dr. Steiner said. And in some lessons, he said they sacrificed themselves in going into the earthly development because, in a way they served, if they want or they don't want, they serve a kind of development which has to face obstacles in the broadest sense of the word. Once he called them gods of hindrances, of obstacles. The possibility of error and the possibility of evil, Dr. Steiner said, are at the same time the possibility of rising above error and evil through our own strength. And the goal is freedom, a freedom which is not pre-existent in the hierarchies. Dr. Steiner said even the seraphim are only following what they have to do out of the Holy Trinity. The freedom dimension is starting in he said, in the realm of the angels close to the human beings, and begins in the midst of the realm of the angels, but only properly can be developed in human beings. This is the dignity and the significance of the human beings, and also what we heard from Hannah Arendt about developing the human capacity of loving and willing. This is new. And even the last Pope, St. Francis, when he was asked once by a reporter, by an interviewer, and you know that he was a Jesuit originally, when he was asked by the reporter the same old question, how can, in a godly, interpreted world, as you do it as a Catholic priest, how can the amount of evil be understood in a world where there is God? And he said in his answer, to make it very simple, the reason and the sense is freedom. To develop the capacity of freedom needs the individual judgment, and to develop this individual judgment, it is needed that there are possibilities for errors and for aberrations. So this is meant to be by the divine world. So it's not an argument against the divine world that evil is existing. The main sense is developing the capacity of freedom. So one time Steiner said, we cannot be angry with Lucifer and Ahriman, and they want the very best. Sometimes we think the opposite is true, but he said, yes, we have to learn to live with them, also because they cannot develop further on their own. He once really talked about the redemption of Lucifer, not so much about the redemption of Ahriman, that the redemption of Lucifer has to do something with that human beings are going the right path. But what does it mean, recognition of Ahriman and Lucifer and resistance? The fully conscious struggle against these qualities arise in human development, Dr. Steiner said. There is only one power before which Lucifer retreats. This is morality. This is something that burns Lucifer like the most terrible fire. And there is no other means of counteracting Ahriman than the power of judgment and discernment trained in spiritual science. For what we acquire on earth as healthy judgment is something that Ahriman flees from terribly. And some anthroposophists always ask, I don't think that they ask Steiner so often, why only Lucifer and Ahriman? Asuras is only a small topic, and the Surat is never mentioned in the mystery dramas. Even the statue of the representative of mankind is only Lucifer and Ahriman. I think that Steiner wanted to say or to show that there is a level, there is an evil dimension behind, but the question if man is able to counteract Lucifer and Ahriman, or to live with them in the right way, then they have no chances. The radical evil needs, first of all, these dimensions. We are not maybe the radical evil, but they are, if not counteracted, they lead us in the wrong way. So in a way, this kind of groundwork done by Lucifer and Ahriman, this kind of distraction, this kind of alienation of what is truly human, by them is the prerequisite, the precondition for the radical evil. So in a way, we heard from Hannah Arendt that we can come to a point where we are not only lonesome, which is good, but also abandoned, and maybe only an element of strong logic. We lost the world. Anders Breivik certainly lost the world. I mean, he has his ideological network, but this is not a world. This is a digital, artificial surrounding. And then in a way. So I would say these first forces surrounding his heart, they were there, but then something can break through, which doesn't terminate, which has no more rules, which is pure evil. And Steiner, I think, what is the optimistic element if we handle these seductions, not only on a moral level, but in understanding deeper how they act into thinking, feeling and willing, which is a Michaelic schooling path, to understand how they act in us, not only in the political or economical sphere, but in us, then it is also a kind of protection, a self-protection, but out of the human being. The human being isn't any more protected by the spiritual hierarchies. If not, I think all these terrorist attacks couldn't happen, because they would protect the victims and they would protect the murdering person. But in fact, it seems to be that they are both exposed totally. And so how to develop an element of protection, especially if we want to, it's a little bit dramatic, but to fight or stand for the Michaelic impulse, we need to balance first of all ourselves. If not, we think we are following a good path, or we are bringing anthroposophy to the world, or we are doing the good all the time, but in fact, this is the same as Robespierre and other people of the French Revolution, and not only the French Revolution, they thought they are bringing the good and the moral good, but in fact they created destruction. And in fact you can do it by different tools, and also anthroposophy also could be a destructive tool, as I think, if the caring person is not balanced, and balancing means also protecting. So this is a needed first step in this whole challenge. So how to overcome this was for Dr. Steiner a very important schooling element, and I think what he called their morality and judgment. We don't know what would have been the third chapter of Hannah Arendt's intended writing about judging and the judgment, but of course it has to do with the same, but I think it has to do with the same approach, or maybe not the same methodological approach, but an anthropological approach. What is a human being in the sense of overcoming these tendencies, these forces surrounding it? We heard about love and self-love, which can also be luciferic, and the love to the world, amor mundi. Steiner said this kind of sacrifice not in the old Christian sense maybe, or a sense of the monasteries, but also a kind of a consecrated work. I mean, Steiner was a workman and others, so a consecration of the work, a sacrifice in the sense of an estimation of labor, in the sense of working for the world, for the development of the world. Steiner said there is also Lucifer's redemption. Lucifer's redemption, if we transform this potential of self-love into love of the world, and also loving our duties. Steiner said we all have to do a lot of things every day which we don't love them, because in a way we are in the Goethe Annum maybe for doing wonderful things, but then there is a lot of daily administration and other things, but we have to learn to love our duty. And this is a kind of redemption of Lucifer, he said, in the way that we try to to organize ourselves, that we love our duties, this is an element where we overcome this kind of Luciferic temptation in a school for spiritual science, because this also seems to be a very ambitious a target, but then there is the everyday life, and to do it sober and to do it correct and to do it in time and to take the whole attention to it. And Steiner was a wonderful a pioneer of this so-called daily work in loving the world. And he said this warm quality is needed, but it's also needed on the level of ideas. I mean, we mentioned Robespierre, and you never can, I think, Danton and Robespierre, you can't compare them to an Anders Breivik. Maybe there was a kind of element of ideology also in the French Revolution, but they had hard qualities. But in a way, they also tried to diminish them, or to not to bring them too much into their own behavior, because if not, they couldn't act anymore in the sense they wanted to act. But in comparison to Anders Breivik, they were still humanists. But this is 200 years ago. And now ideology can become extremely cold, frozen even. And Steiner said, anthroposophy is a schooling path to bring the warmth in the life of ideas. And this is very important, because our intellectual life needs this warmth. If it's only intellectual life, it can become extremely cold. And you all know this quotation from Steiner: every idea that does not become an ideal for your further procedure, it is a destroying element. He's quite, it kills a force in your soul. So only ideas which do not become ideals, that means which exclude warmth and an element of a will capacity. Ideal in the sense of Steiner means that an ideal means that the idea is penetrated by a will capacity. I will do it. So, but, and in between the thinking capacity and the willing is the feeling one. So to take full responsibility for our own ideas. And this is the key for the Waldorf education. Steiner said it is an education where we learn to take over responsibilities for our ideas. An awakening education, we heard. And awakened is also the capacity of thinking in relationship to the warmth of the heart and the will dimension. The will dimension in the sense of also what we heard from Hannah Arendt, the memory, not only acting but also reflecting our own action, memorizing our actions and taking the full responsibility for our actions, but also for our ideas. So a soul-filled penetration of an idea by the will as a warming element in our intellectual life, and brings an inner connection to our whole being. So a kind of living feeling for our own worlds of thoughts, for the life in our thoughts. So I don't think that we can talk only about the will. We did not, and Hannah Arendt never did, without first talking about thinking. Because in a way, and this was her first chapter, thinking, the thoughts, and she was a master, I would say, of these resurrection forces. She didn't mention them like this, but this bringing life back to our intellectual life, to this light, but also warmth, the living power of thought, the life for thoughts. ideals born of the fire, Dr. Steiner said, and light of your heart. And this is in a way needed for all we do later on with our free will. Because Steiner said it's only free if something is leading us, which comes out of an insight in a situation where something is waiting for us. We have to do something in a given situation as an individuality. We need a kind of what he called an intuition in what is needed now, done by me. Not by our emotional strivings coming down from the earth in our limbs, but also not coming from a logic system, with a cold logic system, but something which is awakening in our thoughts, in their dialogue with the heart. And this is, of course, can be done then the source of a kind of a initiative. And in Hannah Arendt's reflection, the moment of initiative, initium, the new beginning as a capacity of the human will, but in relationship to the thinking and also feeling and judging capacity. And then there is a creation for the future. The source of world creation is morality, Dr. Steiner said, but he doesn't mean morality in the sense of an abstract system which we call moral or immoral, but a kind of an end result of an inner process of finding out what has to be done now by me. And we need a kind, Dr. Steiner said, a new kind of trust in the power of truth. I would say that's what Hannah Arendt lived, this kind of trust in the power of truth. She had an enormous courage and fearlessness, but not only as a kind of her personality, but I would say it came out of her special thinking and how to say, of this inner dialogue between heart and intellectual life, that she was able to resist, or she was able to stand and to go in the future. There was once somebody sitting in Dr. Steiner's audience during a lecture, and he noted in his diary a great philosophical moment during Dr. Steiner's lecture on 27th of August 1913. For a moment, I saw the human being as pure conscious will, asserting himself in life and us as such life solely through an immense divine will to move forward. A pure conscious will. It was, by the way, Christian Morgenstern, the poet, who noted this discovery, that he saw Steiner as pure conscious will to move forward, a kind of divine will. It is not only a personal will. This element of he was really centered or awakened in himself, but awakened for what has to be done. We whose task is to be awake, wrote Nietzsche in the preface to the book Being Good and Evil. Awakening, but maybe not only in the thoughts, but also in the heart and in the will. In a meditation of Steiner, there is the sentence, awaken in willing. You are in the spirit beings of the world. This is a longer meditation about an awakening process in thoughts, in the realm of feeling and in the willing capacity. But awakening in willing means you are in the spirit beings of the world. And maybe now, to make it not too long, for Steiner, but also for Arendt at a certain point, it was very important that if the good may come, there is more needed than an individual will. What is needed is a common will. She said, Hannah Arendt, we need an inner dialogue, or also a lonesome dialogue in between ourselves. So I quoted this essay about moral responsibility under dictatorship. And she said, very simply, we have to find out what we are allowed to do in a given situation. And the criminal act remains a criminal act. Even if the state says it's the good thing now for our nation, we have to find, it must be an inner dialogue, not an outer dialogue. An inner dialogue if this is criminal or not. So this has to find out in ourselves. But then she said in the same essay, but if we want to be creative in the sense of if we want to change the world, if we go forward to create a new society, we need the other ones. So in a way, for this intuitive moment to find out what can be done by me or what can't be done. So where I have to say no, the only reference or the only institution is in ourselves, she said. But if we want to work together that the good may become, we need a community. So lonely thinking in an inner dialogue, but in action, Hannah Arendt wrote in Life of the Mind, in which we are always engaged in changing our common world. Because it's a common world. And so there is then the question, how do we work together? And in Steiner's path, beyond the Christmas conference or fulfilling the Christmas conference, let's say in his collaboration with Ita Wegman or with his whole understanding of the inner core of the section, this was never one man or one woman, it was a dialogue in between. So he said, I will lead the medical section through Ita Wegman. And so in the inner core of the medical section was a dialogue. And the same with Marie Steiner, and the same with Edith Maryon, and hopefully also the same with Günter Wachsmuth and Albert Steffen or Elisabeth Frede, which was not established at this point. They had a kind of collaboration, but I would say with Edith Maryon, with Marie Steiner, with Ita Wegman, it was already esoteric. That means intimate, when the will of the one works in the heart of the other. This is out of a meditation for Ita Wegman, when the will of the one works in the heart of the other. Steiner said, be aware if you are connected also by destiny with certain people, how the other person comes to an intimate emergence in yourself. So really, your will also lives in my heart. So if people work strongly together, you can't separate them totally. How to create a new working community? Hegel, coming back to philosophy, but it's maybe not philosophy or philosophy of religion, he said once, the spiritual kingdom is the kingdom of the will. And this spiritual kingdom has to do with people working together. In Steiner's translation of the Lord's Prayer, he's translating the sense, thy kingdom will come, in the version, thy kingdom expand in our deeds, in our way of life. So the expanding kingdom, we enable the kingdom to come by our deeds and our working together. So maybe some of you followed our our conferences about Albert Schweitzer this year, because it was a birthday year for him, and Lambarene was for Albert Schweitzer not only a hospital against the total misery, the medical misery in this spot of the earth, but also an organ of the kingdom to come on a dark place. Dark only because the European imperialist nations destroyed their colonies, or better to say the people living there. And at a certain point of his inner development, Schweitzer felt the need to go there as a European person, as a medical doctor trained in Johann Sebastian Bach and philosophy and religion, and then becoming a medical doctor to cure, as a remedy, these criminal acts by the imperialist nations from Europe. So for him it was an element of counteracting evil performed by Europe in innocent Africa, or at this time it was Gabon. But at the same time, as an esoteric Christian he said, what I try to do there is to enable the kingdom to come or to expand in our deeds. And Lambarene was a really community. It was not Dr. Schweitzer and the patient. It was a co-working community. And so if we talk about Rudolf Steiner and this question about evil and will, I think it's important to finish, not now done by me, with a foundation stone meditation at the end, because there it's clearly said that our good, or our path, we work together. It is not a question of an individuum who saves the world, but also an action of common life and in the public. So in Hannah Arendt's perspective, it was all about public life. And I said at the end, she also saw evil in the public media sphere, evil in the sense of an intended manipulation that the reports in the journals were not reflecting the objective truth, but it was by professionals for mass media, professionals for advertising. They created an image of Vietnam which enabled, or which made it possible that the majority of the population said, yes, we have to do this, because they were not informed. So, and this was for her not only a tragedy, but also because she entrusted the public sphere and was a passionate reader of journals. And so she saw these deformations, but I think she never gave it up, because she published against it. She gave public lectures. She wrote against it without saying, let's now retreat, because it's all gone. And this kind of loving the world means also being present in the world, and not saying it's gone, or it's lost, or it's now delivered to evil. We have to bring to the public something going out. And I see the Christmas conference, personally, as many others, as a deep esoteric impulse of Dr. Steiner to go out. It's a Whitsun impulse, not an impulse of an esoteric school in itself, but a new type of esoteric element in shaping the world, awakening, building up, shaping. That means elements for education, but also for self-education, and yeah, a kind of initiative, a kind of new beginning. There is a Rosicrucian sentence one Dr. Steiner mentioned, maybe not quoted from a book, but from Christian Rosenkreuz, that Rosenkreuz said that the future can be present in human beings as dawn, Morgenröte, Aurora. The future is in the dimension of dawn present in a human being. And Hegel once said that the present cannot resist the future. So in a way, we are living in the present and burdened by the past, but maybe more powerful than the present and all the sins and errors of the past is the possibility of the future. So the present cannot resist the future. So we hope that even, we heard especially from Hannah Arendt, detailed description about the dimension of evil and the radical evil. Today, we hope that this little seminar is not a seminar for losing hope, but encouraging that the present cannot resist the future, and that in human beings the future can be present as dawn, and that initiatives in the sense of initium are possible every day and in every moment. And we have wonderful examples for this also from our friends in countries of war and destruction. So thank you all for listening, or maybe it's not the right word, for in listening forming a kind of a community in listening. It is not to Constanze Kalix and me, it is more or less to thoughts of Hannah Arendt and Rudolf Steiner, or even perspectives. And so we hope that this kind of little memorial seminar is giving forth and kind of hope, or at least encouraging whatever you do in your situation, in your country. And insofar, hopefully, it's worth coming to the end of the year, this 100th year of Rudolf Steiner, to integrate Hannah Arendt's important contributions and take it to the coming Holy Nights as a preparation for the next coming year. So thank you very much for listening and being present and creating together this kind of listening community. Thank you very much.